Hello and welcome to another episode of the Sumer Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Parker Fleming, filling in as I am all summer for Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitrov on this Wednesday show where we're just rotating through, interviewing some smart football people and having some fun talking. Today we have our guest, Kevin Cole from Unexpected Points, a Substack that might be called one of the most essential football research hubs on the internet, as Kevin is just posting and breaking down some awesome stuff. Kevin, thanks for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me. And what's going on with those slackers, Eager and Dimitrov? Come on, man. Let's get going. NFL is a 12-month-a-year business, people.
There's no off season, and Thomas will be like, yeah, guys, I can't do the podcast today. I've got to talk to my GM friend about this business thing we're doing and stuff. So he's doing all the he's going across the globe, jet setting, whatever. Eric's just being lazy. We can make fun of Eric for skipping out on the Wednesday show all we want here.
Dr. Eager is
the esteemed Dr. Eager. I'm excited for this for you to be on today as people who are following along. Again, just been interviewing some smart football people, some from Sumer, some from other corners of the internet. And Kevin, I've been wanting to have you on here just because you've been on what I think the kids refer to a heater the last couple of months on your on your Substack and on your podcast. I'm happy to say I'm a subscriber. I think it's worth every penny, and I'm glad that I can support it and get access to that because it's been some really great stuff. So what I'd love to do today in this conversation is just talk about your background, kind of how you got into football. One of the questions I think that all of us in analytics get the most is, how do I get started? How did you get where you are? How do you do what you do? And so I'd love to hear kind of your story about that. And then I honestly just have a couple of your articles pulled up that I just love to talk about and just talk about your approach. So starting off, Kevin, how did you get here as a football analyst, running your own Substack, doing this kind of research, and how did you get into all of this?
Yeah. I mean, I'm probably have one of the more unique or circuitous type of routes to get to where I am today. I mean, I'm not going to exactly date myself, but I'm a bit older. I'm 40. I'm a man, as once was said in the ranks of college sports. And I started off out of college doing finance sort of working for at the time, I think it was like $500 million type of investment fund, which grew substantially back then for a while, doing that sort of equity research, then moving to New York and being part of doing equity research more on the institutional side, and then also doing some bond ratings and other things there. And along the way, I didn't go to business school, but I got my CFA designation, which is like a certification you can get over the course of 3 years. It's more on the quantitative side, but it's not really super quant type of work. It's not high level mathematics or statistics. It's more just, being able to apply it to things like discounted dividend models and things like that. So that was all and fine for a while. But I started to get into really the fantasy football side of things first. I mean, it's so numbers based. You get such good feedback. I mean, I think generally if you're going to find someone who has a take from the fantasy football world as opposed to the, quote unquote, real football world, there's just more truth probably that has to really be backed up because, the results will come out and you'll be judged upon that in a different way than you can kind of work around with the narratives. And I found a website called RotoViz. And a lot of different guys who had worked at that website, had written for that website, have now branched out into the industry. But really, the creator of that used R as part of his analysis. So I just self-taught myself R, took a bunch of online courses for learning about statistics, did a boot camp for Python, and then just bridged into that area. And as I moved further and further in doing that, I got an opportunity through the job that I was at where they were like restructuring and they allowed people to take buyouts. So I took that, to the chagrin of my wife. I took that and then decided to move into this area. And then from then it's just been bouncing around to one thing and another, moving further and further towards doing real, football analytical analysis, which is the number one thing that I want to do. But along the way, having worked for roto grinders, doing, projections, anything from golf to baseball to basketball and everything else. But this is really what I want to do. And now, of course, doing it on my own, I can do whatever I want, basically.
Yeah, there's a lot of freedom in that, but then also a lot of pressure of like, oh, I've got to come up with ideas to kind of crank things out. I'm going to write down. I think at the end, I'd love to come back and talk a little bit about creative process. Just
Okay.
selfishly, I'm interested in how productive you are. I think I listened to a podcast pretty regularly. Tyler Cowan does his conversations with Tyler, where he just interviews, smart people across all disciplines, and he often talks about the production function. So I'll come back and ask you about the Kevin Cole production function at the end of this to kind of steal the question from him. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I think that a lot of people. It's almost like on Wall Street, they're saying, we'll hire guys who have physics majors undergrad because we can teach them the finance stuff. It's almost kind of like getting into sports analytics. I would try to stay out of sports for as long as possible to acquire the skills, because you can always learn the sport, the specific like the domain knowledge for sports later on. If you're building that base in finance or economics or something else, that often gives you kind of a leg up into being a quantitative analyst when you move to these kind of sports. Well, that's really, really interesting. And a testament to, again, just keep posting. If you're interested in being an analyst, you can be an analyst tomorrow. Getting on
Well,
Substack.
that's kind of another big part of it. It was, connecting via Twitter, having basically no followers with some people at RotoViz. And then I knew Eric, the aforementioned Eric Eager, when he was at PFF, and I was friendly with him. Obviously, people had seen my work, so that kind of helped bridge my move over to PFF. So yeah, that's a big part of it. And then, of course, when it comes to starting the Substack, like if I didn't have an existing follower base, which I could then leverage to go into this, it would basically go nowhere. So I think doing public work, being willing to put that stuff out there is also extremely important. And if you're doing good work, things will come your way no matter what the formal credentials you may have going into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's been a lot of fun. I certainly am, as someone who effectively tweeted myself into a job, I certainly think that's good advice. And it's really cool that we have this avenue.
Just don't tweet yourself out of a job. That can happen.
Yeah, it's a fine line. You gotta find the line and just stay on this side of it. Okay, let's get a little bit into some of this analytics, some of these numbers, if you will, and kind of what you've been working on. So generally, I really admire kind of your broad approach to the numbers. I think that everyone has a prerogative, and everyone, realizing that analytics is a method of thought, not necessarily a dogma. I feel like you do a good job of approaching problems from different angles. Specifically, you went really, really deep into kind of pre and post draft analysis this year, and you talked about some combine metrics that might predict success and what we're looking for when we look at the combine. Could we talk a little bit about that? With what were some of your big findings? Even across position groups, does the combine really matter? Are we overweighting the combine? Why have the combine at all? If we're trying to evaluate prospects, some people might say it's just an opportunity for guys to, wear shorts and do athletic feats that don't really translate. What did you find about how the combine kind of correlates to and maybe even predicts future success for players?
Sure. I mean, maybe I'll just preface this with the fact that the research for this one specifically, a lot of the methodology and, the work on this was just, blatantly stealing from another gentleman named Bill Lauder, who was wrote some stuff for I forget what was the exact name. It was like the Harvard Sports Collective, for Harvard students there. He's like some PhD in something and has moved on to bigger and better things than yapping on about football. But he originally had written this post. Now there, the target variable, kind of what he was looking at predicting, was approximate value, which is a stat that was come up by Pro Football Reference. So I have some other stats that I bring into play. I have my own calculation now of looking at what I call plus minus, like a points-based sort of calculation. But then even at PFF, I had done some of this work too, using their WAR for the calculation also. So essentially, it's something called ridge regression, but without getting into the technical details of it, it's just looking at all of the different percentile outcomes for these different drills, looking at the percentile outcomes for players as far as where they're drafted and for how productive they are over the first several years of their career, and then trying to get an idea to figure out, what's really correlated there. And I think it's important, again, as like a broad thing to say, like there's a huge degree of selection bias in the sample that we're talking about here for guys who are invited to the combine. I mean, they're the best of the best there. So it's not as if athleticism doesn't matter, things like that don't matter. But what you end up finding out for the most part is that the results in these drills have a larger effect on where players are drafted. Especially like speed for wide receivers is one that stands out a lot. Then how well they actually perform in the NFL. And where they're drafted is going to have an effect on how they perform in the NFL also. So just showing that it had that larger effect means that it's probably relatively overvalued. But again, it's in that context that all of these guys are really great athletes that are coming in there. And of course, the combine itself is going to have a lot of medicals, interviews, other things, other drills and other tests that aren't necessarily the headline sort of things that they're putting on TV, but are also going to be extremely important in the evaluation process.
Yeah, absolutely. The economist in me really wants us to like administer a survey to NFL front offices and say, all right, before the combine, rank all these players, and then after the combine, rank all these players. That would solve a lot of our problems. Did you find?
I would even say with that, I would even say you'll find I get kind of annoyed by the combine doesn't matter a little bit takes, because even the same people who will tell you, oh, you trust the tape, combine doesn't matter, this and that. Some dude just crushes the combine and they start floating up their rankings and other things. So I think people are also, their actions as far as their rankings are concerned may not align with how they try to downplay the combine. It has a huge effect on how these guys are ranked in things like consensus, big boards, things of that nature.
And I wonder if there's not some kind of almost like a pilgrimage aspect of it, of I get to see for myself, and seeing it in person, I believe a little more, especially with things like wide receiver measurables. I think like the wide receiver 40-yard dash is where you can anecdotally see a lot of separation of like, oh my gosh, that guy actually ran a 4.25 on tape, measured, laser verified, and it was real. I was there. Did you find evidence that perhaps some of those metrics that are a little more subjective, not just the measurables, like the height, weight, and all of that, but things like the 40, things like the shuttle cone, seeing those in person kind of took away some uncertainty, which increased an evaluator's ability to be confident in that prospect?
Yeah, I think so. And I think when it really plays out, at least when I've looked at it, it's more about boosting guys who are not seen as consensus top players up than it is necessarily in moving them down. I mean, first of all, more and more so, people just aren't doing that many drills. Maybe they'll do the 40, but few players are even doing the 3-cone, at least at the combine anymore, because they look so good. And they're already so far up the board that they can only fall down. And we've seen a number of players, even when it comes to the 40-yard dash here. If we think about like a number of players here, Jackson Smith-Njigba did not run at the combine. He ran at his pro day, which gives him a little more time. Last year, Drake London never ran it. He didn't even run at the pro day. There were maybe some injury concerns, but I don't know if it was that big of a deal. He was the first receiver selected. Jameson Williams couldn't run because of his injury. I don't think it affected his draft status. Marquise Brown didn't run. I don't think it affected his draft status. Jalen Waddle didn't run. I don't think it affected. So a lot of these guys, if people believe they are already fast enough, it doesn't really matter. For some of them, it ends up boosting them into this range of being draftable where they wouldn't have been otherwise. And I just think receiver is just much more of a skill-based position. So it's maybe putting things in people's minds of, well, maybe they can do this that they weren't able to do before. And that's where some mistakes can be made.
Yeah. And I think even, so those are kind of like big, broad changes, right? Of like, no one's going to look at those times and say, oh, I'm going to discount everything about him. I even wonder about the value of like the marginal change. Like this guy ran, 0.01 faster than I thought. How much of an impact is that really going to have? I imagine you're getting a lot of variation from people who ran dramatically different than their perception. And kind of in like a percentile outcome, a 40th percentile receiver ran at a 70th percentile 40. That's going to matter more in terms of raising them than necessarily slight reordering or issues of changing the order at kind of the top of the distribution in terms of who is being overvalued, undervalued, and who's moving up. Those marginal changes are probably less informative than those outlier performances at the combine.
Yeah, and I think that's the case. And I never even know how big of a deal certain things are. I mean, I guess an example of someone who maybe could have fallen based on the combine, but it actually, I don't think it really, I don't think it really actually happened. Like when DK Metcalf ran his 3-cone that was like worse than Tom Brady or whatever it ended up being there. But he also ran a 40-yard dash that at his size speed that completely burst off the chart. So I think he may have had some more injury concerns and other concerns that made him drop. I just think generally we kind of know who these guys are, but I guess I would be concerned if they ran very slow, relatively slow, and we were assuming they were going to be a deep threat or something like that. That stuff that could be concerning. But at the same point in time, we don't see that nearly as often as you see a guy who just couldn't get open down the field and then runs an extremely fast 40, and teams get excited about what they can do in the NFL, and it ends up failing most of the time.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's not some element of that would be directed by kind of the split between group of 5 and power 5 prospects, where group of 5 prospects stand a lot more to gain because there's so much uncertainty about, yeah, that guy looked fast on tape, but who is he playing against and how do I kind of quantify that they can stand out. Then of course, though, for every, DK Metcalf, there is the Racing McMath who gets drafted because he was a big guy who ran that, outlier 40. And so I think there's definitely some interesting variation in lines. You could, it's slice and dice across the combine forever. Moving kind of to the post, the review part of that. And before I do that, I wrote this down. I meant to say, if you're watching, I know we always get good questions. And I like to say, if you have questions for Kevin, toss them in the comments. Would love to, have him field a couple. If you got questions for Kevin, make sure you just toss those in on the YouTube and we'll see them here and chat about them at the end. So go ahead and toss those in as we're asking them. You, Kevin, make I'll call this a bold claim here that and it's just the title of the article. Of course, the article gets deeper, but the title is a bold claim in itself. Instant draft grades are mostly bad, but waiting years for results is even worse. So among the two evils of evaluating drafts, which should we prefer, looking immediately kind of before we know anything else, or backwards in the results, based on a couple of years, based on second contracts? Or is there some kind of appropriate mix of those two ways of thinking that helps us properly evaluate how a team did in the draft?
Yeah, I mean, I align with what I said there, is that waiting years for results is the worst because there's nothing you can do. It's just, it's like saying, well, we can't judge whether or not, spending your life fortune on the lottery was a good idea or not until the results come in. And if you win the lottery, then it was a great idea. And if you didn't win the lottery, then it was a bad idea. What matters or not is whether or not you hit on these picks, but you don't have that sort of hindsight knowledge going into it. So plus I always think it's a dumb thing for NFL media to say, because it's like, literally, what are we going to talk about if we can't talk about how these drafts were until they ended up happening? It's like, some people always complain in that sort of manner, like, oh, you can't talk about the season until we get to Thanksgiving. You can't. So we got to talk about as things are happening. And at least if someone is giving a bad, and I think most draft grading process is bad immediately after draft, at least if they're giving that, you can look at it, you can get some window into what they're doing, you can correct it and get better and get to what I believe is the correct way of doing it, which is trying to make, the most predictive, positive, expected value type of decisions that we know beforehand. At least you can make that sort of argument. But if you're going to say, let's just wait until afterwards, then there's no point in doing anything other than, flipping coins and then figuring out who's the best coin flipper afterwards.
And it's hard because I think about the other day, somebody sent me a link. There's a website. I don't remember the exact name, maybe Beat the GM, where you can go back and do past drafts. And I did a couple, and one, the dopamine rush from being able to go back to 2016 and draft correctly is just excellent. But then I kind of had to put it away because I thought, this is a terrible way to think about the draft. And to look back, it's a terrible exercise to say, knowing what I know now, what would I do? And in some ways, basing the results, basing it entirely on results is cheating a little bit and saying, knowing what I know now, would I have changed the outcome? And that really doesn't help us, because drafting is all about the process and all about what you know going in and kind of maximizing your ceiling. It's possible for someone to have multiple very, very good drafts and still lose and get fired, which kind of goes into the other article I thought was really interesting. about time horizons and the principal agent problem, specifically how the GM owner kind of continuum is a little bit odd because GM turnover is a lot higher than I think most people realize. Could you explain a little bit how you frame the principal agent problem in the draft and with GMs, and why that's something we should consider as analytically minded people looking at drafts, looking at outcomes, looking at results?
Yeah, sure. So the principal agent problem is something that's been around for a while. Often it's used when talking about businesses and talking about executives and businesses who have explicit incentives to do certain things, which may be good, maybe like short-term sort of goals in order to enrich themselves, which don't necessarily align with the incentives and the goals of the owners or the longer term investors or stakeholders in a particular company. Now, I would say in the NFL, though, like a lot of these ownership groups are pretty impatient and can be led around by their tails as far as what's going on in media and others. But I think it also comes into fans as maybe being another kind of stakeholder that should really be interested beyond the longer window. And what I found in that one is one of the bigger things, and it really reminded me because I was thinking about if teams would draft quarterbacks early, and I looked to teams like the Lions and the Falcons this year, and I just thought to myself, man, they're in year 3 of this new GM coaching combination. They're both predicted to do a lot better than they did last year. The Lions looking like they're going to, well, not looking like they're going to win the division, but they have the best odds to win the division. Falcons are not quite as good as the Saints, but let's face it, it's a pretty weak division. So we can see what ended up happening there. And you just look back in the past and you say, if you do not get to a winning record within 3 years, make the playoffs within 3 years, you're almost certainly gone as the franchise. And I think it really comes into play for quarterback picks, because rookie quarterbacks are almost always worse as rookies than they are later on in their life. And even if you hit on a rookie quarterback, like a guy like Stafford or Derek Carr and many, many others, Alex Smith was awful for a pretty long time. Like, your performance is not necessarily going to be good, and then you could end up getting fired on that thing. So these guys are like highly incentivized to say, how am I going to continue moving forward in this third year, be very concentrated on this third year result to retain my job, as opposed to what may end up being the best thing for the franchise. If they scrape into the playoffs with Jared Goff with the Lions, or if they scrape into the playoffs with Desmond Ridder looking like a mediocre type of quarterback, which I don't know, maybe he'll be great. It's possible, but he's a 3rd round pick. It's not a high success probability sort of thing. That's going to retain them their job probably for multiple seasons at that point. But is it really better for the franchise than if you took a shot at a quarterback who could end up having a much higher ceiling in a year or two from now, even if it downgraded your results this year, when, let's be face it, they don't really have a chance to win the Super Bowl anyway. It's more about getting into the playoffs and maybe winning a playoff game.
Right. And it is interesting. I think about, again, not to frame everything in terms of sims. That's just something I've been doing a lot of simulation this offseason. And there is kind of the idea, I think if a GM had a immunity clause for 10 seasons, pretty much anyone could flip around an NFL team in 10 seasons, and they could make the long-term kind of strategic moves. Not anyone, but could make those moves to build up the team and to progress and turn things around. And so by, continually turning over, trying to hit gold immediately, I think that there is some kind of self-hamstringing with NFL teams. Now, patience is hard to preach because, fans are going to stop coming and you've got to figure out how to build there. But this idea that you want instant results on a process that's inherently long does induce a lot of like variance into how we should evaluate a GM's tenure, because they have to make more high variance moves earlier in their tenure rather than be able to build foundationally. It'd be nice to draft 5 linemen and 4 defensive linemen and try to take a couple flyers on elite quarterbacks and draft multiple quarterbacks over multiple years. But you can't do that early on, because if they don't hit, then you're not going to be able to capitalize on that success and build the foundation that you want to build going forward.
Yeah. So actually, he's behind me. If people watch YouTube, my man Sashi Brown, in the background here, R.I.P. Sashi. So when they started in 2016 with the Browns, and he brought in Paul DePodesta and that whole new regime there in Cleveland, what they had this conversation with Jimmy Haslam, who had fired guys on pretty much an annual basis going into this. So, and he said there was a conversation that DePodesta mentioned in an interview that he had with Haslam, and he asked him, what are you looking for from me, from ownership, as far as this process is concerned? And what he told him is his analogy was, a lot of owners will say, I want to do this, I want to be analytical, I want to do this whole thing here. And then he made his analogy was to like the kid who begs their parents to take them on the roller coaster, this big roller coaster. And then they get up there and they see that it's really scary, and maybe a little bit scarier than I thought. And there's some ups and downs, and you might have to wait, and all these sorts of things that come into it. And then they're immediately saying, no, I'm off. I'm out of here. I want to, abandon ship. And that's what you can't do. Now, of course, Sashi got fired like a year and a half into his tenure, and they did abandon everything when they went 0-16 their second season. But they were trying to win their second season. It wasn't like they were trying to win, but you know what? They took a shot on Deshaun Kaiser in the second round, which they got a ton of praise for in the offseason, right? Like when they made the pick, it was like, oh, it's a great pick. And then he gave them, an historically bad quarterback season, and Hugh Jackson wasn't helping, I don't think, as a coach at that point also. But before that, Haslam was saying, oh, they have at least 3 years to really get going. And then it all got booted into the sky when things didn't go well for a couple of seasons. So I agree with you, although I do think you can turn around pretty quickly in the NFL. Like I mentioned, even here for the Browns, they really cleared. I think that's another thing teams should do a little more often, is like, if you're really going to clear the decks initially, go ahead and do it. And then going into their second season, they signed guys like Zeitler and they were spending money in free agency. They just happened to miss badly on this quarterback and not have a veteran option who they could turn to at that point. And got, like, it was a team that probably should have won 4 or 5 games that ended up winning 0 just because of bad luck there. So I think you can turn around quickly, but you're right. One of the things I suggested in there is maybe even incentivize these GMs and coaches to take a quarterback pick by giving them some additional guarantees or something like that on their salary, because they're so risk averse to do so after they've been a couple of years into their stay.
Yeah, and I mean, even look at I think the Jaguars are another example of how you can build pretty quickly. Not they're obviously some extenuating circumstances off the field there, but they went 4-29 over the last 2 seasons before 2022. They had negative 300, almost 400 point differential over those 2 seasons, and now looks like they should handily win the South and maybe win a couple of playoff games. And eternity does begin anew in football. I think a lot quicker than people realize. I will point everyone to Up on the Zone at sumersports.com. Our own Sean Clement has an article that uses transition matrices to talk about drafting and improvement. So if you're into nerdy math and want to read more about that concept, you should check that out. Kevin, as we're moving into kind of the last half of this podcast, last segment here, I want to talk a little bit about those grades. So we talked about how do you grade the draft? What's good? We talked about GMs and owners and how they kind of move together. You've broken down some AFC analytical draft grades and some NFC analytical draft grades, kind of trying to calculate who did well based with the capital they had. I want to ask you about your approach there, and then maybe 1 or 2 teams, and I'm going to get your opinion on a controversy regarding the Texans and what they did. So tell me generally about your analytical draft grade approach, what you feel like it brings, and maybe what you feel like it might gloss over and might not do so well at helping us evaluate.
Sure. So there are, I'd say, 3 main categories that I'm looking at and then trying to get a number. So first thing I'm trying to do is, how can we quantify this in a way where you can actually apply it? You can bring in different concepts and have it on a universal scale. So the scale that I'm looking at is based on surplus value. So the value that you're getting over what you would expect to get from a free agent at a similar draft pick. That's really why the draft is valuable, because you're getting cheaper, their contracts are set and you're getting cheaper players than their value on the actual field. So that's kind of the universal metric. And then the 3 things are trade value, and that's looking at the average trade value you can get at a particular draft spot, the average surplus value you can get. And then normally, of course, trading back gives you more value than trading forward. The second thing is positional value, and that's looking at kind of the average surplus value you can get for a particular position at a particular spot in the draft versus drafting just an average, any sort of average at that spot. And the last thing is what I call discipline, or mostly not reaching for players. Because what you find, and again, this is based on research that's been done, you find that players who are reaches, in other words, they're being taken a lot earlier than what a consensus big board would say, do tend to underperform their draft position. Guys who are steals, and now this is like the biggest disconnect, because most draft grades are based upon like, oh my God, they got so many steals in the draft. You find that those guys don't really outperform their draft position. Even if you thought they should have been a first round pick and they were a second round pick, they mostly play like second round picks. There's only a little bit of marginal benefit there. And I just quantified, trying to use these exact numbers, what the dollar value gained or lost is. And if you wanted to, you could even take that number. I hadn't done it here, but if you wanted to, you can even take that number and plow it back in to figure out, what sort of draft pick gained type of value did they get based upon how much surplus value you can expect from different draft slots.
Yeah, and it's a kind of a comprehensive approach. One thing that strikes me, again, just in kind of the way that I think about things, is counterfactual. There is some value, and I'll bring up the Colts as an example of this. They didn't trade. They got value from not going knee jerk and trying to trade up. They were patient. They stayed there, and then they didn't trade back. They still got their guy. So they're potentially bad trades, negative value trades that the Colts could have made, but they did have that discipline, and they got Anthony Richardson. Overall, you have them as a plus 15.2 millions. It's in millions dollars added, and then 22.8 in positional value, and that gives them third overall in terms of the draft there. So that you had them a little bit lower on the discipline, but in terms of positional value and the trades they made, let alone not making those trades, it seems like they were one of the stronger drafts, getting that quarterback in the first couple of picks there.
Yeah. So the positional value is largely driven by the quarterback pick there at that part of the draft. It's just, even if you get an average-ish sort of quarterback play, the amount that they're worth in the NFL just trumps everything else by large degree. And in fact, even in the top 5 picks, because you're paying them more money, like there is this, you can either call it a fast decay of the amount of money you're paying them, or a rapid acceleration as you're getting higher, as you're getting closer to the front of the draft. Because of that, it's even harder at that point in time to make money on other players because you're paying them a higher salary. But one thing that I'll mention on this, and maybe this kind of even it takes away from some of the analysis, but even here, I'm saying the Colts were the third best team as far as the value they added. I have it at about a $42 million. We're still talking about $42 million over like the life of these players' contracts over 4 years. So $10 million a year, it's not going to like make or break necessarily your franchise. So if someone has a bad draft by these metrics, it's not going to make or break their franchise. If someone has a great draft, it's not going to make them, the top team in the NFL. But what it does is, assuming that you're doing as well as you can in the player evaluation, and over time you're going to be at, average-ish or maybe slightly better in how you're evaluating and hitting on players, it's just giving you more upside to gain more value, or it's giving you more room to make those more mistakes. And after we talk about 2, 3, 4 drafts, you start really adding up a lot of money, and that's how it can be good. But again, my grades are not going to align with how well these teams are going to perform. There's going to be like a very weak correlation, or a weak, like kind of R squared on this sort of thing going forward. But there will directionally be in the right direction. It's just you have to hit on these exact players, and that's something that unfortunately we just can't figure one team is better than another because they're all so good at it.
Yeah, and the margins are especially thin there. Speaking of the margins, I think we might just stay in the AFC South. I don't know if I'm like the world's most casual Titans fan, and so my fandom basically peaks around draft season because I'm just desperate for some reasons to be optimistic. Looking at what they did, I thought it was really interesting. Peter Skoronski is one. They got Will Levis, who a lot of people mocked in the top 5. They traded up to get him, but they got him in the second round, which is, I think, better than getting him in the first round. Bold take there. But with Peter Skoronski, I think it's interesting how we would approach grading them, because they draft him a tackle. If you get a tackle in the top 15, a lot of surplus value, potentially a franchise guy there. If he moves inside to guard, which is on the table, I think, because of his measurables and maybe the needs the Titans have on the line, how should we measure that draft pick? Should we measure that based on they took a tackle and they still got this surplus value or this value out of a guy playing on the line? Do we need to penalize them for his development and maybe not being able to play tackle? How do we approach guys that might switch positions or move inside or outside, where the potential surplus value gain is dramatically different, I think, between a tackle and an interior lineman?
Yeah. I mean, my numbers are based upon the position they were listed as, at least in this database I have, as a draft pick. So it will include players who were listed as tackle, but then eventually ended up being guards. But even that said, most guys who are tackles and are taken that early end up being tackles in the NFL. So if he doesn't, it is going to have overvalued that type of pick. And they're kind of two different components when it comes to tackles in particular, probably more than any other position, is there's just not availability outside of the first round, but even the first, maybe 20 picks of the first round. There's just not a lot. Whereas for guard, there's a ton of availability in the second round, where they're normally actually pretty good values in the second or third round. So yeah, it would definitely drop their value quite a bit if he did have to shift over. It probably means that he wasn't as strong of a pick as the numbers would tell you for tackle generally, just because there really isn't that opportunity cost for taking a guard. There's a lot more opportunity cost because you could have done that with a later pick, whereas you just can't really do it with a later pick for tackle and it's seen nearly as much success.
Right. Okay, but I'll ask you about the controversial Houston Texans and their moves, and then we'll get to that production function question and see if we've got anything in the comments to wrap up here. All right, the Texans, you have them 31st in terms of draft surplus value, added negative $40 million total of surplus value. Ironically, really great positional value, 39 million, but the trade was just so costly to get the second and the third pick. So I know some people have tried to backwards induce and say, well, if they knew they were going to take a quarterback at 2 and they traded up, they were trading up for the quarterback and we should value it as such. What lens are you looking at this trade? I mean, obviously they got 2 great players. They got 2 guys who should have very productive NFL careers for them at cornerstone positions. But they gave up a ton. How do we conduct a break even there? How do we even try to evaluate whether that was a plus EV move or not?
Yeah, I mean, for my numbers, here it's calculated with a highly, highly negative trade value and then a pretty highly positive positional value because of the second pick being the quarterback and then the third pick being the edge rusher. Now, if you change the assumptions and you wanted to say, well, they were actually trading up for a quarterback and then they took an edge rusher at 2, my numbers wouldn't change in aggregate. Like once you net out the numbers, they'd be exactly the same as they are. It would just flip around some of the net gains and losses for positional value based upon those picks. So bad either way. And, I guess you could say for some teams, it's theoretically possible that trading up and getting some sort of elite talent is worth more because than having, multiple good players that you would get with the picks that you're trading for, because you can only develop so many players, because you can only have so many, elite players, so many edge rushers, so many left tackles, and so on and so forth. I don't think Texans are quite there yet to be one of those teams where you could say that they're so filled out everywhere. And I think that's normally a mistake. Like whenever we hear like a complete team can take a running back in the first round, another, halfway through the season, they're looking for cornerbacks or wide receivers or other positions that they could have had somewhere else. So I don't know. I just think it's very, very hard to justify this trade. And of course, it's one of these situations where it's like the house money effect is what they call it. You have this pick that you got from the Browns trade, and teams and the Cardinals did this too. They traded out of that pick and then they gave up capital to go back up again. Like whenever you have that kind of house money, you see it quite often that teams are kind of devalue the extra trade capital that they've gotten, and they want to just be able to do, to get the exact player that they want. And that seems to be part of this also, is they said, you know what, we already have this Browns pick. We've already made our quarterback pick. Let's just go ahead and burn some picks and move up and get the player who we really wanted at edge. I mean, it's just a really, really negative play. He just has to have he has to be basically like an all-pro type of player, I think, to pay off for what they're going to end up paying for him, because the salary is not going to be insignificant as the 3rd overall pick also.
Yeah, it's almost like an inverse or even a perverse endowment effect. Whereas normally
Yeah.
endowment effect means I have this, I don't want to give it up. But the this is I have two of these. Why don't I just give up more than two of these to get something for less value? And again, that's where results come in. I mean, I don't know if it's a good trade right now. On average, probably not. Could the Texans, have Will Henderson be All Pro and he and C.J. Stroud take them to the top of the division? Maybe they're good players, and so I think that that's where the results and process are kind of interesting there. Okay, looking at our time, I will direct everyone to unexpectedpoints.substack.com where they can read and listen. I'm a subscriber, so I'm not sure. Your podcast is free, correct?
Well, I do one solo Q&A that's free, and then
Okay.
about, I don't know, I'm trying to think, like 40 minutes out of sometimes up to an hour and a half of the interview podcast is free as part of the preview, but the rest of it is behind the paywall.
Great. Well, I would direct people there anyway. It's absolutely worth it for a couple of bucks a month, and can read deeper dives. We've just scratched the surface on all of this. So check out Kevin at Unexpected Points. His Twitter handle is at Kevin Cole. I think there's 3 underscores after that.
Yeah,
correctly.
I know. I got to figure out what I'm going to do with that. I guess I'm going to have to throw NFL on there or something. But I'm just holding. It's just a holding space. I'm waiting for. I heard something. If there was like if an account was inactive for a certain number of days, Twitter might look at opening up. So now I can come at, at Kevin Cole, at Kevin_Cole, all these guys who've been the bane of my existence, taking up all those handles.
Yeah. Well, in 2009, when I joined Twitter, I thought for the very first time, I got Parker as a handle at Parker. And then I thought, this is stupid. I want people to know me. I need to be professional and all that. And so I gave up at Parker. And now I'm like, I'd do anything to get that back. But that's great. Kevin Cole with 3 underscores. Kevin, last question here that I'll ask you again is about that production function. You're highly productive. You think up interesting questions and ideas. You implement ways to kind of research them and come up with satisfying answers to the tune of 2 to 3 articles a week, and including long form interviews and question and answers. Tell me a little bit about your production function, your creative process, how you write so much, how you come up with ideas, and kind of daily workflow for you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not the most regimented, I guess, when it comes to those sorts of things. I mean, normally I have way more ideas than I actually even write up. It's just like getting started on getting the virtual pen to paper sort of situation and writing it up. Because sometimes I could even be bad about doing a bunch of quantitative analysis and plotting things out, and then it's like getting it onto the paper.
I do that all the time where I do the quantitative analysis and I think, I'm satisfied with this answer, and then my motivation to write it up is I found the answer. I don't care if I write it up. That's always the hard part for me.
Yeah, so that's kind of the tough part. I think during the season, there are it's very regimented as far as doing the reviews, and I try to get them out extremely quickly because I'm crunching all of the numbers based upon stuff that's at NFL Faster and others that are coming through the numbers quickly. So it's like, okay, you're reviewing all the different games, you're putting that out, weekly updating power rankings, weekly updating some different adjusted quarterback numbers and other things I have. So that's pretty regimented. Off season, it's a little bit different. I mean, going into the draft, as you mentioned, it was like 2 to 3 articles a week I was putting out. The last couple of weeks has been more like 1 to 2 as we get into a little bit of a slow season here. But it's just really trying to make sure I'm hitting the numbers that I want. And like I said, for this last couple of weeks, it's more like 1 to 2, but before it would be 2 to 3. But a lot of times I don't really have a problem with idea generation. It's just more, getting it out into the world. Like, how much time do I want to spend on that versus researching deeper on something or building something that's going to take a long time, like having to rebuild different simulations and other things I'm working on for this season. That is going to make a big difference. And it's especially going to be useful, I think, when a lot of subscriptions are going to come in maybe in August or September. But at the same point in time, I want to be, I'm constantly still thinking about current things that I want to have fresh out there. So it's balancing those two. But for me, like, deadlines matter a lot when it comes to the season. So this part of the season, it's really just making sure when I have an idea to get it out there, because there's not going to be an external motivation or deadline for doing so.
Right. That's very, very interesting. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate this. Again, we barely scratched the surface. I wanted to ask you about like your weighted model and quarterbacks and all that. Maybe we'll have to do that another time because again, we could just go down the rabbit trail. But really appreciate your time and enjoyed talking to you. Thanks to everybody who has tuned in and listening. This has been the Sumer Sports Show. I'm your host, Parker Fleming. We will be back Monday and Wednesday. I've promised it, but Wednesday,
Dr. Fleming,
Dr. Fleming, and. Just across the finish line.
You do the whole thing with Eric. You're like, hey, doctor. What's up, doctor?
Exactly. I'll be back next week. I believe Tej is finally going to join me now that he's graduated and back from his trip and everything. So we'll have some good content on here. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, Twitter, wherever you get podcasts. And we'll see you guys next time.